Disclaimer: this story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. The night began with laughter, but underneath it, something heavier pulsed. We were all gathered in the living room, half lit by the amber glow of a single floor lamp. Music hummed low, the kind that wraps around you and slows your breathing. My husband was across the room, deep in conversation, but I felt another gaze on me. It was him. His eyes found mine over the rim of his glass, holding me just a second too long, like he was searching for something I hadn't yet given. I looked away, but the air between us seemed to pull tight, invisible threads drawing us closer even when we stayed apart. Later, in the kitchen, we crossed paths. A simple reach for the same bottle, and our fingers brushed. The warmth lingered far longer than it should have. My shoulder grazed his as I stepped past, and he didn't move away. I caught the faint scent of cedar and something darker, and my breath caught before I could stop it. We talked, nothing important, just small things, but the pauses between our words felt loaded, like the silence itself was daring us to close the gap. His voice was low, steady, yet there was a slight hitch when I leaned on the counter, closer than necessary. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears. When he laughed softly at something I said, his eyes didn't leave mine. My pulse stuttered. I could feel it, that dangerous edge, the moment where curiosity threatens to tip into something irreversible. We stood there, the world beyond the kitchen fading away. The space between us shrank until I could feel the heat radiating from him, my heart thudding against my ribs. His gaze dropped briefly to my lips, then back up, and for a breathless instant, I thought, but he stepped back. Just far enough to let the moment hang in the air like an unfinished sentence. The night was far from over. The space between us didn't stay empty for long. I moved past him toward the sink, but his hand brushed mine again, not clumsy, not rushed, just enough for me to feel the soft warmth of his skin. My fingers curled instinctively before I could stop them. He didn't pull away right away. Instead, his thumb grazed the edge of my palm, almost like he was memorizing the shape of my hand. I forced myself to focus on the sound of running water, but my body betrayed me, leaning slightly toward him. He noticed, of course he did, and a slow smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the kind that holds more questions than answers. From the other room, I caught a glimpse of my husband's silhouette moving, his voice drifting in with laughter. The reminder should have cooled me, but instead it made my chest tighten. There was a dangerous thrill in the idea that someone could walk in at any second. He leaned on the counter beside me, his arm brushing against mine. The fabric of his sleeve was soft, but underneath it, I could feel the heat of his body. His eyes flicked down, once, then again, to my lips. I felt the sting of breath catching in my throat. I told myself it was nothing, but the way he lingered said otherwise. When he reached for a towel just behind me, his fingers trailed across my back in the lightest of touches, setting off a spark that seemed to ripple through my spine. It could have been innocent. It could have been an accident. But I knew it wasn't. A sound from the living room pulled my gaze away, my husband's voice, a little closer now. When I looked back, his expression had shifted. There was something sharper in his eyes, like he'd just decided this was a game he intended to win. We stood in silence, our shoulders still touching, neither of us moving. The air felt heavy, charged with a kind of electricity you can't fake. Then it happened, a sudden crash from the hallway as someone stumbled into the kitchen doorway, pushing me closer into him. Our bodies met fully, the warmth of his chest against mine, his breath brushing my cheek. My pulse roared in my ears. And then, his chest was still against mine, the faint rise and fall of his breathing syncing with my own, until I took a small step back, too small to really break the contact. His eyes followed me, a flicker of heat and challenge in them. I tried to speak, but the words caught. He leaned closer, just enough for his voice to brush my ear. "You should go back out there," he murmured, his tone low, almost teasing. But his hand remained on the edge of the counter beside mine, trapping me in a space that felt both safe and unsafe all at once. I turned my head slightly, and now our faces were inches apart. His gaze dropped for half a second, I noticed, and so did he, before he straightened, deliberately giving me room. I exhaled, but before I could step away, he moved past me, his shoulder grazing mine in a slow, deliberate drag. The kitchen felt too small, the light too warm, the air too still. When I reached for a glass, he reached too, his fingertips brushing the inside of my wrist. The contact was fleeting, but it was enough to make my pulse quicken. He didn't apologize. Instead, he smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips that told me he was keeping count of every reaction he got. From the living room came another burst of conversation, but it felt far away. Here, it was just us, orbiting closer and closer, testing the edges of whatever this was. I tried to distract myself, turning toward the fridge, but when I closed the door, he was right there. Close enough that I caught the warmth of his breath against my cheek. He didn't move. Neither did I. Then he stepped in, just one step, but enough to close the distance entirely. "Careful," he said softly, though it didn't sound like a warning. We stood in that electric stillness for a beat too long, until he did something I wasn't ready for. His hand slid along the counter until his fingers brushed mine again, but this time they didn't leave. He laced them through, holding me there. And then, his fingers were still laced with mine, the warmth of his hand seeping into my skin like a secret I wasn't ready to admit. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft rhythm of our breathing, though his head changed. It was slower, deeper, like each inhale carried a weight. When I finally looked up, his gaze was locked on mine, unwavering. The rest of the room blurred away. It felt like the walls had closed in, trapping us in this charged space. He stepped closer, so close that the front of his shirt brushed against me. My breath hitched. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the faint thud of his heartbeat if I leaned just an inch closer. "You're not moving," he said softly, a playful edge under the words. "Neither are you," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. His smile deepened, slow and deliberate. He lifted his free hand and let his knuckles trace the length of my arm, from wrist to elbow, light enough to raise goosebumps. When he reached my shoulder, he didn't move away. Instead, his hand lingered there, warm and steady, anchoring me in place. The air between us thickened. His face was close now, close enough that I could feel the ghost of his breath against my lips. My pulse thudded in my ears. "Maybe I'm waiting for you to tell me to stop," he murmured. "Maybe I'm not going to," I said before I could think better of it. His eyes darkened, and for a heartbeat, neither of us moved. It was the kind of stillness that feels like the last second before a storm breaks. He leaned in, just enough for his forehead to almost touch mine, the smallest gap between our lips making the air feel electric. Somewhere behind us, the sound of footsteps entered the hallway. We both froze, our hands still tangled, our bodies still dangerously close. The shadow crossed the doorway. The shadow in the doorway passed without stopping, just a friend looking for the bathroom. The moment could have ended there, but it didn't. We pulled apart, though not by much. He gave me a look that felt like a question and an answer all in one, then walked out toward the living room. I followed, my pulse still uneven. The music had shifted, something slower, warmer, and people had cleared enough space in the center of the room. Someone called out, teasingly, "You two should dance." I opened my mouth to decline, but before I could, he was already holding out his hand. His smile wasn't asking, it was daring. My husband was across the room, laughing with another couple, paying no attention. My chest tightened. I took his hand. The crowd faded into a blur as he drew me into the small open space. His palm was warm against mine, his other hand finding the small of my back. Even through the fabric of my dress, the pressure felt intimate, grounding, and dangerous. We moved slowly, the music's rhythm pulling us closer with every turn. His thumb traced lazy circles against my skin, each one sending a shiver upward. Our eyes locked, and I caught the flicker of something in his, not just desire, but the thrill of knowing we were playing with fire. When I glanced past his shoulder, I caught my husband's gaze for the first time that night. He was watching now, his expression unreadable. My heart thudded hard. I didn't know if it was fear, guilt, or something else that made my breath quicken. "You're distracted," he murmured, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "Maybe," I said, meeting his gaze again. He smirked, leaning in so close his breath brushed my ear. "Let's fix that." The next step in the dance pulled me closer against him, our bodies aligning in a way that felt deliberate. His fingers pressed a little more firmly into my back, my own hand tightened around his. It wasn't just a dance anymore, it was a silent conversation neither of us was willing to end. Then someone bumped into us from behind, throwing me off balance. His arm tightened around my waist instantly, holding me upright, my chest pressed fully against his. His face hovered so close I could see the small curve of his lips, the heat in his eyes. The music slowed further, our breathing sinking again. The room, the people, even the music seemed to fade, leaving only the thrum of my pulse and the way his hand lingered just above my hip. It felt inevitable, the way gravity pulls, that one of us would close that last inch. And then, the bump from behind had brought us closer than we'd been all night, and neither of us stepped back. His arms stayed firm around my waist, anchoring me there. The music swelled softly, but my world had narrowed to the space between us, barely a breath, barely a choice. His forehead lowered until it rested against mine. My eyes closed for a second, my chest rising and falling with the same slow rhythm as his. The warmth of his skin, the faint scent of him, the subtle shift of his hand against my back, it was overwhelming in its quiet intensity. "You should go," he whispered, though his grip didn't loosen. "You don't want me to," I replied, my voice trembling just enough to betray me. He gave the smallest shake of his head, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "No. I don't." That admission seemed to settle over us like a final truth, something we'd both been circling all night. My fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, holding him there. For a moment, we weren't dancing, we were just standing, swaying in a space where the air itself felt heavier, charged. I thought he might close the last inch, that we'd tip past the point of no return. But then, over his shoulder, I caught my husband's gaze again. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood another woman, her hand on his arm, leaning in to say something that made him smile. It was a jolt I hadn't expected, sharp and confusing. I looked back at the man holding me, and in his eyes, I saw it, the recognition, the same mix of curiosity and challenge from earlier, now tinged with something new. "You see it too," he murmured, not as a question. I nodded, my pulse thudding harder, not from guilt but from the sudden shift in the game we'd been playing. This wasn't just about us anymore. His fingers flexed at my waist, pulling me imperceptibly closer. "Then maybe," he said softly, "this isn't over yet." The music faded into another song, but neither of us moved. The air between us stayed thick, every unspoken word still hanging there, waiting. The music shifted again, lightening into something playful, but we didn't move right away. His forehead stayed against mine for one last breath, his hand resting firmly at my waist. Then, as if by silent agreement, we stepped back, but not far. His thumb grazed my side as he let his hand fall away, the smallest touch that still sent a ripple through me. He didn't speak, just gave me that look, the one that held a question and a promise all at once. I answered with a faint smile, knowing it said more than words ever could. My husband caught my gaze from across the room. His expression was calm, unreadable, but his eyes lingered for a second longer than expected. I felt the echo of that first moment in the kitchen, the heat, the pull, the unspoken dare, only now it was layered with something deeper. We drifted back toward the others, slipping into conversation like nothing had happened. But every so often, our eyes would meet from across the room. Each glance carried the weight of what almost happened, and the possibility of what still might. Later, as people began to leave, he passed me in the hallway. His shoulder brushed mine in the same slow, deliberate way as before. This time, his hand briefly rested on the small of my back, a warm, steady pressure, before he stepped away. "Good night," he said softly, a glimmer in his eyes that told me he wasn't really saying goodbye. I returned the smile, letting it linger just long enough to leave the door open. By the time I reached the front door, the night air felt cooler, but my skin still held the memory of his touch. The game wasn't over. Not yet.